Hello and welcome to another episode of Great Women in Compliance with Hemma Lomax and Lisa Fine. We are sponsored by Corporate Compliance Insights and produced by the Compliance Podcast Network. Now, in compliance, we often talk about systems, rules, and oversight. But what about the conversations between people, the context, the behaviours, and the culture behind them? Well, today's guest is helping organisations do exactly that, listening to signals, honouring trust, and building a humane approach to oversight. I am so thrilled to welcome Anna Pitt-Stanley, co-founder and chief operating officer of Umony. In this episode, we'll dig into her journey. You'll get to know her really well. We'll talk about her prior ventures, the pain that pushed her and her co-founder, Dean Elwood, to start Umony, and how they lead as C-suite executives who care deeply about integrity and empathy. Anna, welcome to Great Women in Compliance. I'm so happy that you can join us today.
Thank you so much for the invitation, and it's an absolute delight to be here with you. Thank you, Hemma.
Oh, you're very kind. Well, you are an absolute delight, and this is why I wanted to share you with our listeners. And so before we even talk about anything compliance or your entrepreneurial journey, I wanted to just introduce you, Anna, get to know you. So maybe let me kick us off by saying, what's something about you that people seldom see? Maybe a source of energy, a formative memory, or a personal value that guides your leadership?
Okay, so I think fundamentally I'm quite egalitarian in my approach to people and to the company, really. I like to think of myself as being really fair-minded, and I like to think that I can shape things in a way for people that makes their lives better and interesting. So the company's, in a sense, a reflection of myself and the CEO, Dean Elwood, who's also my husband. And it's a venture to do better in the space, to make a difference.
Oh, and that's such a beautiful way to start this podcast because it really is the essence of culture and the things that we as compliance officers talk about a lot. We're always after this magic nugget that is culture building, but the way you've described yourself and how it reflects in your company is that's the North Star. That's what we're looking for. So I'm so thrilled to hear you say that. I know this about you. Now, informatively, you have an LLM in law from LSE, is that right? I think you studied securities regulation. Tell us a bit more about that because you've got a deep experience in operations and settings, but when did you first sense that your path would be at the intersection of law, tech, and oversight?
I think it was more accident than design. I had a girlfriend actually at university with me who wanted to go into the banking sector initially, and I think she was very interested in securities regulation. And I don't know, we talked about it a lot, and then I think I decided one day I'd at least study it and try to get to grips with it and what it really entailed. And so I did. And I did it as part of my LLM, and I really enjoyed it. And I think for human nature, it's a good idea to set boundaries for people because you need that, otherwise, you get chaos. And so, compliance is really about organizing and making sure that as a society and in a very important industry, the financial services in particular, you have governance in place and you make sure that it works. So I don't know if that answers your question.
No, that's so insightful. You're making me think really because there's an element of compliance that seems a bit mystical, but I love that you say at its root it's about organizing this governance piece. And actually, we should have the skills of that in other areas of our life. We don't always see the connections. And so I think you're really good at this, Annie. As a chief operating officer, you are a good connector. You're a doer. You're a translator across functions. And I think you, in your day job as a COO, you are doing governance compliance through those things, the connections, the organization. So tell us more about that, how that translates into the way that you show up in your job as a COO.
Again, probably not by design, more by accident. I actually ended up being, strangely enough, in charge of the process for becoming certified to do the engineering that we do for the banks by doing all the ISO 27000. We do ISO 27001, we've done 42001. And so that ended up in my department, and I got very good at it. So that's the structured governance. In terms of the people, actually, I think we have a very loose culture, and I quite like that. I don't know. I think perhaps maybe as we grow, it's going to become more difficult. And I think we will have to start buttoning things down. But at the moment, we actually have a really quite loose culture, and I think it gives people the space to grow. And I just not feel like they're working within a box. Maybe
Yes,
maybe because I don't like that.
that's right. And look, you're right, because compliance can sometimes be seen as a box or constraining, this, heavy rules, heavy regulation. But I've met some of your team members, and I think the key to what you call it a loose culture, I would say it's a culture of trust and a culture of psychological safety. And so loose is probably a word us compliance officers don't like too much, but actually I think what you've done is you've created a really good environment, conditions where your employees can thrive and they can bring their best selves to work. They can share ideas. They can speak up to you and Dean and feeling safe to do so. Is that fair?
Yes, I hope so, very much. Hope so. I mean, one of the things about owning a business is, in some respect, you have responsibility for the people that you employ. I feel that very deeply. And I hope along this journey for them, I'm making good memories for them, if you know what I mean. I hope that they will look back on this period with us and think it was instructive. I learned a lot. And actually, we do, I can't say we don't set boundaries, but of course we do in our own way. I mean, there are acceptable things and there are unacceptable things within the company. But I quite like the idea that people think for themselves and they get on with their job in a way that they like to work.
I love that. I love as a core value allowing people space to think for themselves and actually, again, trusting that people can do some of that. I mean, again, might sound like fighting words to compliance officers, but I see the wisdom in it. I think we get a lot more out of people when we have those shared values and we show some respect and trust. And one of the things I used to say is being decision useful, having agency to share your insights is really the magic, isn't it? If you allow your team members to show up at work and share their talents, leverage their talents, that's really the height of culture. And then everyone can be looking, maintaining the boundaries together, right? It's a shared value system and everybody is policing that.
Absolutely. And I think we've managed that to date. I don't know as we scale whether that's going to last because we'll start to we're very selective about how we hire.
Yeah.
We take a long time to hire and we try to find the right cultural fit, even if it's not the most talented fit, person, because it's so important to us. It's got to be fun. Coming to work has got to be fun. It's got to feel like it's working for the people who join us every day for the journey.
I love that. I love that. Well, that's a really good foundation for us to talk about how other organizations that you serve at Umony do scale, right? Because, it's very difficult to think about how we can keep those boundaries and keep those values at scale. One thing that you do, and I referenced it at the top of the call, is you look at the communications within a culture as part of your product at Umony, which I think is fascinating because, again, we do a lot about systems, we do a lot about processes, but you and Dean have stepped into this arena of where we can collect and store and analyze the actual communications within the culture in a company at scale. Is that right?
Absolutely. I tell you, the more fascinating part about compliance and oversight on how people communicate, and I looked at this a long time ago, and I really would like to go more deeply into it, is this whole balance between privacy and security. And what actually takes who, you know, who makes that decision about how far I'm entitled to step in one direction, particularly in privacy. And when you start to impinge on somebody's privacy, I don't know. It's a conundrum, really, isn't it?
It really is this balance between the rights of the individual and the rights of the masses. And I think it's something that compliance officers wrestle with a lot. And privacy is a big consideration when it comes to collective communications. I think where the line's drawn is often what behaviors does the company want and what leverage do they have to ask for consent for these things, right? So I'll give you a good example of that. I am where I work. I was asked to, we were all asked to volunteer to have our phone monitored, right? Our personal phones in a wall, of course. It was a voluntary thing, but we were told if we weren't able to sign up for that, we would not be able to do our work, access our calendar, our email, our Slack on the phone. I'm like, hold on. The greater good for me of like actually being able to do my work meant that I wasn't too worried about my personal privacy. So again, it was a choice, it was a consent, it was an opt-in, but certainly there were consequences to not opting in. And I think that's the balance that companies need to strike. It was a very thoughtful way of doing it. It's like we're not going to insist, but there are consequences. We won't be able to do the thing for the greater good if you don't consent. So choose. And so, as a reward for access to those things on my personal phone or on a work phone, I do need to be able to acknowledge that the company will have to look, will have to audit. And I guess the beautiful thing about Umony is it's at scale, we are now able to collect these communications at scale and look for not only things that might go wrong, but things that are going well. Is that right?
Absolutely. I mean, and that's part of the idea that we have about recognizing good behavior in the same way that you recognize bad behavior. So I have a fantastic quote that somebody mentioned to me, which is poor conduct often leads to bad conduct. And I think that you can start to see whether someone is on that trajectory when through their communications and how they're moving in a direction that you don't want them to move in. So I think within the company, we obviously have some oversight of the communications, but much less obviously than we are implementing in other companies. It's our job to do that. And in a way, I think AI that we're also implementing now as part of our compliance product is better as a tool because being non-human, it's almost non-invasive. It's not someone reading about your private life or your private conversations or what have you. It's a machine. It has no interest in your private life and it's not going to be able to take anything away from it, other than obviously just the learnings from the machine as it learns. But so it's anonymized in a sense, and that would give me a sense of comfort.
I understand what you're saying, absolutely, because the issue there is we are able then to carve out exactly what is appropriate and not, right? We are able to look at the specific things and cancel out the noise.
Yes.
You bring up a great point because I remember one part of my role when I was an enforcer investigating cases at the SEC was to look through lots and lots of emails that were produced.
Yes.
And we had to do a lot of that manually. There was some search engines that helped you narrow it down, but you get some false positives. You'd see who'd bought flowers for who. I was really not interested. I did not want to see it. But the technology now allows us to filter much better, much less fuzzy matching, and it can get the prosecutor, the compliance officer really closer to what they're looking for as opposed to the noise they don't want to know. And maybe people didn't want me to know they were buying flowers, but it really wasn't my focus. It's a waste of everyone's time.
Exactly. And so actually you do filter out all the noise, but I like the anonymity about it in a
Yeah.
way. It's a machine looking at what you're doing rather than another person who may form, an opinion or may repeat what they've seen actually.
Let's talk about you and Dean. You've also co-founded another company, Voxygen, is that right?
We did.
Which I believe was later acquired. Tell me about that. I mean, you said you maybe accidentally fell into it, but tell me about this idea of this entrepreneur's journey for you and Dean, how you found a problem that needed solving at scale and then put your minds to doing that for your customers.
I wish, Hemma, I could say to you that there was a plan, okay? That we sat down at a table and said, this would be a good idea. But actually, I don't think it was more natural than that in a way, because Dean started the company and then it just started to grow, and he is really not that good at administration. And so I'm very good at it. So we ended up where I was doing the things that he's really bad at, and he does the things that I really know nothing about. And so it was a good combination, of skills. There was definitely it didn't start out in compliance; it kind of morphed into compliance, and there was an opportunity because working with telephony, Dean understands telephony to the nth degree, and so there was an opportunity to get into compliance through that knowledge of recording communications. And so it was more of a journey than a plan, I would say.
I love that. And then what is it that made you both decide then, having exited with Oxygen, having, the big success of entrepreneurialism is that somebody buys your company, and then you guys got together and started again with Umony. What made you want to go back in?
Sheer madness, I think. When you've done it once, it's so much easier to do it again
Ah,
because you understand all the things that went wrong. And boy, there were definitely things that went wrong while we were in our first company. It wasn't perfect by any stretch. Overall, it was successful, but we made our mistakes along the way. The second time around, you have that opportunity to do it with all the learnings behind you and to improve. And it's actually really nice to do that, actually. I've far enjoyed the second company to the first one because sometimes you can't really go back and correct those mistakes for one reason or another. They're there and you live with them. But it was great to come along, in the second journey to fix it all.
no, I love that. I love that idea of, sometimes it just works itself out, but you need to get back up and do it again to really have the benefit of the growth, benefit of the learning. I get you. I get you 100%.
Yes.
To Umony then. So what is Umony, and what problem were you solving when you were building this product?
Oh, really, I suppose communications compliance for financial services is I would say, the predominant view. Obviously, there are periphery industries which are attractive to us, but that's our core business. We've learned a lot about banks and what they want and what they don't want. We've learned a lot about how our business can try to cater for that in the best possible way. And it's an interesting journey. I don't think Dean and I could ever have gone back into the workspace. I just think we needed to do something else for ourselves. I don't know. Maybe we got used to it. It's fun. It really is fun.
Oh, you're having fun for sure.
We are. It is fun. I mean, obviously, there's a lot of problems along the way, and it's definitely not an easy industry to break into. Banks and telcos, they both have their own problems and very long sales cycles and all sorts of things. But I don't know. Maybe
No,
we're just
I was going to say, like, one of the biggest pains I think that the industry was feeling at the time was there was massive enforcement attention on these financial institutions. They were getting big fines for not collecting these communications and
yeah.
not using the data they should have access to mine for intelligent insights, to mine for risk. And so I don't know if it was coincidental that you were ready just when the fines started coming, or if the fines themselves were what made you both see this opportunity and dive in.
I think it was a combination of things. I think it was Dean's expertise with that particular technology. It was a problem to solve, and it was, a necessity as well. I mean, I think 2008 crash highlighted the absolute necessity for banks to be properly regulated and to start putting some boundaries in place and some rules for the way things were done. I read somewhere that 34 million people lost their jobs through that crisis. It was horrendous. Yeah, we needed to fix what was going on in the banking industry, and it needed to be worldwide, really.
Right, and you're right. These enforcement focuses and fines didn't come out of nowhere. To your point, there were some scandals. The LIBOR scandal, I think, was happening in the UK at the
Yes.
time. And if I'm not mistaken, I may be having a fuzzy memory of this. As these things went to trial, you started to see that there was evidence of the potential wrongdoing in the communications. Like they had evidence that we could have prevented this had we been listening to the communications that were happening. Is that right?
Absolutely. There's no question about it. I don't know whether you've ever listened to the conversation. It was Allied Irish Bank between the two senior executives. Did you ever?
No,
You
but
don't?
I think this is what I'm referring to. I've read about it. I didn't listen to them, but yes, tell us more.
Hemma, you would have fallen off your chair. It was so bad. It was so derogatory. It was so uncaring about the consequences of what was going on at the time. And they never got prosecuted but actually one of them, I think his name is Bao, if I remember correctly, one of the executives was later prosecuted for fraud. And this goes back to my earlier point where I was saying poor conduct leads to bad conduct. He was, if you'd listened to that call, you would have known this guy is on a trajectory that's just not right.
And as you say, you mentioned the balance between the individual's privacy rights. But when you talk about the magnitude of the impact of this behavior and the systemic impacts in the
Yes,
banking industry of this behavior, it starts to become clear why actually there's an imperative to do what we can in these organizations to prevent that type of thing, to detect
absolutely.
and prevent. And again, that's where it starts to become really interesting for the compliance world, because it's easy to talk about how challenging it is. And you and Dean have navigated the challenges of your customers worrying about privacy. We'll talk a bit about that. But once you've got access to these communications, it's almost imperative that we look for the truth that is hidden or trapped in those communications.
And, it was catastrophic for the world at the time, really, if how many people were affected by it. And it was all the banks, really. It was global. So I think compliance is like any other governing set of rules. It's there to protect people as much as anything else. And you have to maybe you have to give something away for that. So for the greater good, right? It's for society, for the greater good.
One of the things that really intrigues me about this space as a compliance officer is, as I said at the top of the call, many of the things we do in our profession are we create processes to have the employees, the third parties interact with us, disclose this, ask a question, speak to a hotline. It's really asking them to do something that's outside of their normal journey. We may, if we're lucky, grab some expense data or some transaction data to see how they've behaved in hindsight. But what we've never really been able to do is track the behaviors through the actual communications. Like, it just occurs to me as you're talking, no fraud can be committed without some form of communication. No insider trading can be committed without, some kind of tips or being sent from one place to another. And so it stands to reason now that we should have been looking at the communications all along.
Absolutely. And I'm sure had that happened, and I'm sure in any scenario where it's still happening, it's probably a leader rather than an event. You can probably see over time where people get more and more relaxed because they keep getting away with things that they shouldn't be doing.
That's right.
And finally they keep pushing the parameters. I almost think that we never get out of that child mode with their parent where you keep pushing the boundaries, don't you, just to see how far you can go without being caught. And I think it's really something in human nature.
I was just thinking about my kids. I was like, yes, my job as a parent, I always say there's parallels between parenting and compliance, because my job as a parent is to reinforce the boundaries. And if I don't, for example, I can tell my children you are not allowed to use YouTube, but the
Yes,
way I behave every time they do, they will keep doing it to see if I really mean it. And it's a slippery slope. I love the phrase you used, from poor to bad, is exactly what we can prevent if we can consistently drive behaviors. And again, this is the beauty of communications analytics, especially now with the technology, right? To do it at scale,
yes,
to your point, and do it anonymously, to do it in a targeted fashion, means we can nudge behavior. We can see whether we can even actually, I would say we could see around corners, right? So for example, in the insider trading example, let's say there's an increased amount of communication between two trading desks, or some people start speaking in code all of a sudden when they didn't before. These are
yes,
early warning signals to
yes.
behavior. So, my children picking up the phone is my signal that they go on YouTube, right? We can start to track the behaviors before they happen. A bit
Absolutely.
of behavioral science there, but we are smart enough to figure out what the precursors to bad behavior, whether with children or with our employees. And the fact that
Absolutely.
we can track that now, I think, is magnificent. Also, well, let me just stick with that for a second, because that's a really good point. Full disclosure for our audience, I'm on your advisory board. I enjoy sitting with you and your team and your other board members to learn about this. And so it's really interested me. We often say in those meetings, the truth of behavior lives in communication.
Yeah.
How does that show up for you? What experience have you seen of the truth of behaviors? Any examples where you can say your customers are going to be better off now because they're looking at the communications?
I mean, we don't actually see the communications of our
Of course,
customers.
yes, of course.
Everything's encrypted and it goes into their repository, their storage repository, and they only have access to it. But I think we have spent enough time in the industry to have read enough examples of how people have manipulated markets or have, pushed pricing or just done side deals. All sorts of scenarios come through, and you can see that. I mean, we're not privy to the real stuff, unfortunately, only what comes out in print afterwards. And that's what we're there to try and prevent. Again, to stop the slippery slope. You need to have controls in place. And I think the current controls in place, there's nothing wrong with them other than they're not managing to get through the large mass of communication that's actually being created every day. And so this is where we come back to our product. And I started talking about AI perhaps a little bit too early, but this is where we think our product is so valuable because it will manage to go through so much more communication in so much faster and pick out the bits that are not going to, that are going to raise flags, either positively or negatively, either way.
No, you're right, and it's never too early to bring in AI in this day and age. Because it really has changed the game for us. I mean, it's not recently that the regulators have been. I mean, you mentioned the 2008 crisis. We've had a good decade and more to be thinking about how we can do this and how we can prevent it. And regulators have been bringing fines, but it hasn't been easy to capture and store and analyze this communications data at scale. So, for example, the recording of email communications or the storing of that stuff that's not new. We as companies, we've had that stuff. But have we been able to get any intelligent insights from that at scale? It's been very challenging. I did want to ask you about what Umony actually does. So if I'm not mistaken, Anna, correct me if I'm wrong, you are focusing on the telephony, as you mentioned. So you're capturing communications through calls, maybe WhatsApp messages. Is that right? Are you managing to get a bigger, not just the emails, you're actually getting the calls and the WhatsApp. Is that right?
That's correct. So we do both. We do written and we do verbal. And yes, it's going to happen in both areas, isn't it? It's possibly a little bit, there's much more maybe, it's easier, I think, to track the written communication somehow. It's sort of,
Yes.
it's more tangible in a way than the voice. And people can have conversations without getting onto a telephone. When compliance is not going to stop the problems, compliance is only going to just provide barriers, and probably it's a good way for a bank to be able to say that at least they're trying. I don't think we'll ever get rid of the rogues in this industry. There are going to be people who are going to come along who are determined.
No, that's right. Look, with the advent of ephemeral messaging, I used to work at Snapchat, these ideas of disappearing messages, there's always going to be new technology for the person that wants to genuinely hide the way they
Yes.
communicate. And that's right. And that's the same with any compliance work, that we don't really keep up with the speed of the worst actor, but we certainly make sure, to your point, that we're not creating a culture where there's a slippery slope and we're almost encouraging bad behavior. So I love that distinction. That said, you're doing pretty well. You're speeding up towards the things that we find sticky, the things that I will want to use every day. I'm unlikely to now start doing my work communications on a Telegram or a Snapchat because everyone else lives on Slack. So you really are keeping up with us in many ways. It's really important that we do leverage technology and keep looking for more and more ways to help and get these insights, right? These insights.
Indeed.
But to your point, if we're not thinking about the bad actors, the one thing I get very excited about when I hear you talking about this is the green flags.
Yes.
The insights that can show, for example, this is a bit selfish, but that my compliance program is quite effective in 99% of the cases.
Definitely.
To show that. So tell us a bit about green flags and how they show up in this data as well.
It's in the same way that it would highlight poor behavior over a period of time, or maybe with the same caller constantly being singled out as having bad behavior or poor behavior on calls. In the same way, it would highlight that there are people who are complying and that they're doing all the things that the FCA or the SEC would be asking them to do, and perhaps maybe even turning down a suggestion that they might do something untoward, or, who knows how many variations of a theme there are on communications and being, on one side or the other. But at least the compliance departments will know that their traders are doing the right thing and that they're saying no when they need to say no, or they can't do something when they're being asked to do something, and that they are following the rules. And that could be comforting to a bank to know that.
And celebrating those wins and those good behaviors is just as powerful, right? So good behavior begets great behavior, maybe, to flip your quote on its side.
And that the training programs are working. I have never worked in a bank's compliance department, but I expect that there's some training programs going on and things to highlight. And so if they can see that the training programs are working and that people are doing things properly, then it's, it must be a comfort.
That's right. I mean, not only that they're working, but also it can turn into good training. So I'll give you an example from one of my roles. And one of the things we work on quite often is gifting and, when to say no, thank you. And it's very easy to say, these are the rules. Do not accept this gift. Do not give this gift. But oftentimes it's not just the what, it's the how that's missing. And so I used to try to run workshops called The Art of Saying No, Thank You. Just to try to help our employees with putting the words in their mouth, because you'll laugh, but you might want to tell a white lie. If somebody says to you, "I've got tickets for Wimbledon this weekend," or Wimbledon's a bad example. "I've got tickets for the football game this weekend. Can you make it?" You might just say, "Oh no, I'm busy." It's a simple white lie just to get out of it. But of course, then the customer might come back and say, "Oh, no worries, I've got season tickets. Pick any date." And now you're stuck. You've actually got to explain why you can't expect it. And worse would be compliance said I can't. What if you're a bit like Hemma and you say, "But why? Why does compliance say you can't? That's silly." Now you've got to answer that question. So we realized we weren't equipping people with ways of saying no, thank you. They would feel comfortable with it, wouldn't embarrass themselves, and wouldn't inadvertently suggest wrongdoing when it was unnecessary. What you've just made me realize is if we can pick up the green flags, I don't need to be the only one thinking about examples for that workshop. I can actually pull examples. Here's anonymous examples of when your colleagues said no, thank you, elegantly worked, right? Go one step further. I know this doesn't seem like compliance, but often bad things happen when people are pressured and want to take shortcuts. Shortcuts
Yes,
to what? To gaining revenue, new customers, new clients, whatever it might
yes,
be. But if we
yes.
can show that a certain way of customer support, customer communication leads to better revenue, I can offer you the alternative. You might be under pressure, and you think your only option was to take a shortcut. But here's 10 of your colleagues that were under the same pressure and still kept revenue up by asking in this way or communicating this way. So I'm really excited about, once you've collected this data, what else we can use it for, even in compliance, to leverage it on here's the right way of doing things, the how, as opposed to just don't do this and good luck.
Yes, exactly. I quite like it. For me, though, there's something really quite nice about a machine and the anonymity instead of somebody sort of trawling through your decisions. I don't know. There's something really nice about it spitting it out and putting it in a format so that it doesn't point here, there, or anywhere. It's a good overview of what's happening. I
I
quite
love
like
that. And of course, again, that's a lever that you can offer, right? So if you're looking for evidence of wrongdoing, you can probably find out who it is that's doing the midnight trading over
it. Yes,
here. But if you
yes.
want to look for evidence of good work or systematic patterns and trends, that can obviously stay anonymized. And is that right, that your customers can choose the levers of what they do and don't make anonymized?
Yeah, you could anonymize the output of
Right.
it from any AI system. I mean, I know there are a lot of problems with bias and all that. We're working on all that to make sure that transparency and biases, and we're doing a lot of work in that area to eliminate the biases. I don't know. I prefer to think in a way, once there's a problem, you need a human being to evaluate what that problem is in some detail, and a machine may not be the best thing to do that. But in the whole scheme of running through everything, it's probably not a bad idea to just have a machine do it.
No, I agree. And you've taken the words out of my mouth. I wanted it as a perfect segue to this idea, this concept of the human in the loop that many of us, like, as compliance officers, professionals, are wrestling with right now. Like, how do we keep the human in the loop? We've talked a lot about the benefits of not having the human. So at certain stages, what do your customers do when it comes to keeping the human in the loop when it comes to using the product?
It it only ever does the first analysis of the
Mhm.
communication, and from there it moves to the compliance department for further evaluation. But of course, it covers off a much greater number of communications than any compliance department with just people in could do in a day. I mean, it processes it so quickly. So you have full coverage,
Yeah.
and then you still need to take the problems to the people to evaluate.
No, that's wonderful. And so that and there are ways that you can do that on sampling. You can do that by looking at false positive matches. I love the point about anonymity to preserve dignity, to preserve the lessons, the patterns without necessarily feeling like surveillance. I like that a lot. Wonderful. Well, look, I wanted to just pivot a little bit now to back to your leadership role, and change is often resisted. So let's just talk about your team for a second. What lessons have you learned as a leader in bringing people along rather than forcing them to be into these spaces?
So we had at least half of our current staff have been on our journey with us from the Voxygen days. So they left the
Nice.
company Voxygen when it was sold, and then they've moved forward with us. And I think there's an element of trust that there is innovation in the company and that it's a good thing to move with that innovation, because I think even if you just have to open up a newspaper or listen to what's going on around you, a lot of people are worried about AI being able to do a lot of jobs. So the only way that you secure your own future is by becoming part of that future of development and innovation. And we saw an opportunity 3 years ago to get onto that trajectory, and we just pushed ahead with it. And actually, the staff were really excited about it. I think engineers like to be challenged. I mean, if you get the right sort of engineer, they like to be challenged. They like to be on the edge, on the cutting edge of engineering and what's happening in the marketplace. So actually, I don't think there was much of a struggle on our part. And so most of our staff have engaged with AI in one way or another and have enjoyed it actually. And I think would like to get more involved in it if they could.
Oh, Anna, so you make things sound so effortless, and I'm going to challenge you a little bit here because I do think you've created that culture again of psychological safety, of being creators of the culture as opposed to consumers. I think that's what I'm hearing, is that you've built a team and you've inspired them to create the future with you as opposed to being consumers of something handed down. I think that's possibly some of the magic under what you've done as I'm listening to you.
See, Hemma, I never think about it. The way I approach life is I like to think I will do what I would enjoy. So I
Yeah.
try to put in place for other people in the company things that I think, you know what, that would be nice for me. Would I enjoy that? Yes, I would enjoy that.
I'm going to ask you, what tips would you give to our listeners who are maybe struggling with bringing people along? So I'm going to challenge you now to mine your experience for some tips for us.
How would really, if I was going to put it into one word, I think probably just being genuine with people, literally being genuine with them. And I think people pick that up. They are very sensitive, and they know when, if I say to someone, I really care about something, I think they believe me. You have to be genuine for people to believe you. And if people don't believe you, they don't believe in you. I don't
So
know.
no, that's so powerful. I think you captured that beautifully. People will derive their trust and confidence from you. So I love that. I love that. Let's do a couple rapid fire, and then I'll ask
Okay.
you one question to close. Myth about compliance oversight that you would love to bust.
Oh, the compliance is boring.
Ah, brilliant. I love that. I'm with you on that 100%. It's not boring at all. One behavior or habit you'd encourage all compliance teams to adopt tomorrow.
I suppose be open-minded about the different ways of approaching your job.
Very nice. This might be an unfair rapid fire question, but let's try it. One failure you've learned from and what it taught you about leadership.
Ooh. I think allowing anybody to blackmail you in a sense. So to give you an ultimatum and say, if we don't do it this way, I'm off. Or to somebody to put pressure on you to do something because they have some sort of advantage over you or the company or what have you. I won't let that happen again. I have let it happen, but it was a very good lesson.
You learn from that, and I love that. Okay, and then one piece of advice for someone building a culture of integrity from scratch.
I think you really have to like people, and I think you really have to, and being with people, and I think you need to understand, you need to be able to put yourself in their shoes, I think.
Yeah, radical empathy, curiosity. I love that. I love that. Oh, Anna, well, I've got one last question, then we'll obviously ask you to share with readers how they can contact you. But I love to ask this question, and I think I'd love to hear your answer on this. What legacy do you hope that you leave with Umony, not just in surveillance capability, but just how organizations treat their people?
I think really, I hope everyone will regard me as having been fair-minded and fun to work with. Really, if that's all I get out of it, and that they felt safe working with us, I think that's probably the most, and that they knew that if they got into any trouble, we would stand by them and we would do our best. So I think those are probably the things that they would regard me more, but they would regard more the personal relationships they had at the company than the actual the work that they did, really.
Well, what a fine legacy. I would venture to say that it's not merely aspirational, Anna. Your legacy is not an end of days thing. It's a living legacy. I know that you do that. You show it in that way every day, which is why I said you are a delight and utter delight. I am so grateful that we got to share you with our listeners. Would you please just let us know where they can find you and where they can find out more about you, about Dean, about Umony?
We've got a website, umony.com, and we have a LinkedIn profile as well at umony.com, and there's lots of things going on LinkedIn. I think those are probably the two main areas where we have a public face. So that's it. And now we're on your podcast too.
You are. Well, yes, welcome to the Great Women in Compliance community. Thank you for this conversation.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Well, thank you for reminding us that compliance isn't just about detection, but about dignity, not about just rules, but about listening and caring. To our listeners, if this episode resonated, please like us, rate us, share us, follow the show. If you want to dig deeper into how organizations can govern communications with integrity and empathy, you'll want to go see Umony at www.umony.com and connect with Anna on LinkedIn. Until next time, keep showing up with courage, curiosity, and compassion. And thank you for joining Great Women in Compliance.
Thank you so much.